now. All right. So up until this point, we've mostly dealt with individuals in the realm of psychology, right? So we looked at the human mind, we look at the biology of the mind and how it's formed not only environmentally but genetically, and we considered how people learning, some theories of learning through classical conditioning and operant conditioning, right? If we reward somebody for doing something, likelihood is they're going to perform that behavior again, right? That's learning. We looked at memory. We looked at how personalities is next week, how emotions form, right? How we deal with stress. So for the most part, I would say for the most part, we can look at an individual and predict what behavior is going to be like. Now you put that individual into a group of people and all gloves are off. We have no idea what they're going to do. Their personality type that we thought we knew them to do changes when they're in a group setting, right? And your book kind of echoed that. Now, your book talked a lot about some theories and some concepts. I'm going to try and cover as much of those as I can today. Ones that I thought were important. But throughout this, I'm going to start off this question as, why do you think people do bad things? All right. Just think about that. You don't have to answer it necessarily, but think about that. I mean, throughout history, we've seen slave owners, we've seen Nazis, we've seen perpetrators of history's worst atrocities, right? And how do they successfully dehumanize other people for so long? And why do those people take that, right? And even at a smaller scale today, we're looking at our school systems. We see bullies, kids that are beating up other kids for their lunch money and tying their shoes together and giving them wedgies, right? And yet they manage to go home and pet their dog and hug their grandmother and say, "I love you," right? So these are the same people but they get caught up in these social situations and things tend to be a little bit different. So most of what we've been studying, like I said, so far has been focused on the individual. We've covered subfields of psychology like cognitive personality, and we're going to get into clinical psychology here in just a couple of weeks. But we tend to address the phenomena contained within the single person's mind. But then we have social psychology, which focuses on the power of the situation, and it determines how we think about influence and relate to one another in certain conditions. And it's better equipped to answer this question about people doing bad things and even good things sometimes, which I'll cover here in a minute. So I'm going to share my screen with you here just so I can take some notes and you can kind of see how horrible my spelling is and how badly I multitask with writing and spelling and talking all at the same time, right? Okay, so oops, resume share. All right, so social psychology can not only give us some of the tools that we need to understand why people behave terribly, but it also gives us an understanding why we sometimes act heroically. Like Jean Valjean, right, revealed his true identity to save some stranger from being tried in his place. And why Nazi Oskar Schindler, if you've ever seen Schindler's List, risked his own life really to save others from almost 1,000 Jewish people from certain death, right? And of course, I think one of the videos we had asked, why did Darth Vader throw the Emperor down that deep hole, even though he was being electrocuted for his son, right? So social psychology is very much at play in everything that we know about us and about everybody else. And I can say there are really no easy answers to about humanity's greatness or brutality, but think of this in terms of social psychology. So we're going to try and understand why people act like villains or heroes. And one of those things that we're really asking, did they do what they do because of their personality, or is it because of their situation, right? And this was one of the theories that Austrian psychologist Fritz Heider began looking at. I don't know what happened there. With attribution theory. Now, attribution theory is just that. It looks at the attributes in two different realms. So it simply suggests that we can explain somebody's behavior by crediting either their stability, their enduring traits, also known as their disposition. And next week, we'll talk a little bit more about disposition as in terms of like primary personality traits, right? So disposition will put stability, like individual stability. Okay, and then we have situational, dispositional, sorry, and situational. And that could be environment, something externally. Actually, I'm going to put internal here, just to kind of keep it a little bit more sense. So, so with the attributes to somebody's environment, for example. So let's take an example. Say, you know, this guy named Philip, and he's at a party and he's just kind of hanging out in the corner and being by himself all night. You might assume that he is shy, right? So us assuming that his personality is just he's a shy guy. He's not really interested in people. That would be dispositional. We're attributing his behaviors and his actions to his disposition, right? But maybe that's not the case, right? Maybe you know him, and normally he would be the type of guy that's doing beer stands, right? Or getting up on the table and dancing like Shakira or whatever he likes to do. But since you know that about him, that is not his disposition, you can say that maybe he's got a headache, or he just twisted his ankle, or he's just not feeling well for whatever reason. Those are situational explanations. And an overestimation of those forces of personality while underestimating the power of the situation is called fundamental attribution error. Now, for attribution error, I'm going to call this FBE, or I'm sorry, FAE, okay, because it's going to come up again. I don't want to spell the whole thing out again. So FAE, all right? So fundamental attribution error, as you can imagine, making any kind of error that can really end up warping your opinion of another person and leading to false snap judgment. Now, think about, let's think about this in terms of, maybe some of you were driving today or driving this week. I think I've used this example before, and somebody cut you off. How do you feel in that moment? What do you feel about that person in that situation? Does anybody care to share that, if that's happened to you?
I mean, I don't drive yet, but I think I would feel kind of frustrated.
Okay. What do you think about that other person in those moments? It's okay if you're brutally honest. I mean, you're going to kind of prove my point anyway.
I'll be honest, I feel road rage at that moment.
Okay. Yeah, you feel that person is a jerk or an a-hole or a fill in the blank. You think this person is a blank negative something, right? Yeah, that's our tendency, right? So we do that. We do that intentionally because we don't want to accept the possibility that it's something due to the environment. We start attacking their disposition almost immediately, and that winds up in fundamental attribution error. And this might not be such a big deal, right, when it comes to your buddy Philip, being shy in the corner. But according to college studies, 7 in 10 women report that men have misread their polite friendliness, which would be appropriate for the situation, as a sexual come on, right? So that could be a really big problem, especially with today's looking at discrimination and hostile work environments, right? That could be a problem if things are misread as dispositional and not situational, right? And I'm not saying that in any way that they should be ignored, but it's something to look at when we're considering some situations that we see in the news or within our homes or even within our cars, right? To avoid, like somebody said, to avoid getting out and beating the crap out of somebody just because they blew through a stop sign, right? What were some of the situational things that might have been occurring? Why are people homeless? How many of you walk by a homeless person and give them change or cash or even food, right? How do we choose to explain other people's behavior every day, and we choose to believe what we choose to believe can have really huge consequences. For example, our political views were likely strongly influenced by whether we decided to attribute poverty to homelessness, or homelessness to a personal disposition, like they're just being lazy and they're looking for a handout. That could influence how we behave. Or maybe they had some kind of social circumstances, like, especially in today's environment, we know that jobs are hard to get. We know that education and opportunity might be a little bit difficult during these times. And these can, in turn, affect our actions. And activists and politicians know this. They know it well, and they use it to their advantage to persuade us to do what they want us to do. And this is something that back in the 70s and 80s, psychologists Richard Petty and John Cacioppo developed what they called the dual process theory. I'll write that in here. Dual process theory, which looked at two ways that we are influenced. Okay, the theory of understanding and the persuasion behind it. So the first part of their model is known as central route persuasion. Now, central route persuasion looks at, and many of you that watched persuasion is that watched the debates are really based on action, right? It's calling on basic thinking and reasoning to convince people to act or believe a certain way. And this is really what's at work when interested people focus on the evidence of an argument at hand, and they're persuaded by the actual content of the message. So when you're watching a political debate, or ones that we did watch, you might be persuaded by the candidate's particular policies, positions, or voting history. So we look at more the facts and actions with central route persuasion. And just the keynote on actions, on the facts, sometimes the facts, many of you will be taking statistics. Some of the information in there might be biased, right? We might be able to say that just in our wording, that something looks more attractive than it actually does, right? And that's kind of truth in advertising as we look at it. The other type of persuasion we can see is called peripheral. Now, peripheral route persuasion, I'm not going to spell out persuasion, looks at everything surrounding the facts. So it's almost like a distraction, okay? So the influences, this influences people by the way of incidental cues, like the speaker's physical attractiveness or personal relatability. They may not actually have actions and facts that support why they should be the one that you choose, but there might be some other things going on around them that makes them look, kind of influences your gut reaction. So you might decide to vote for a particular candidate because you think they're cute or they're from your hometown. Peripheral route persuasion happens more readily when you're not paying attention to really the facts. And that's why billboards and television ads can be really, really effective. And that's how politicians and advertisers really push certain choices on you. I think most relevant to me and what I do and how I see this in my field is drug representatives. All right, drug representatives, they might be good people, right? But they're there usually, and book representatives as well. They're there to sell something. So I can tell you, drug reps are probably one of probably the most friendly people that I work with on a daily basis in my practice, and they're probably the most attractive, right? Their hair is done so nicely. They've got makeup that's just for females just right, or the men. Men sometimes, they got their eyebrows plucked or something. They're just very symmetrical and very attractive. And that's for a reason, because you don't know the facts. They're giving you as much of the facts as they can about these drugs, but they're there to sell, right? So they're using peripheral route persuasion to do that. And that's not a practice that's been uncommon throughout history. In fact, it's been almost an accepted practice, right? But it turns out that the reverse is true. Our attitudes can be affected by our behaviors, right? And we talked about biofeedback theory when we were talking about emotions. I don't know if you remember that, but one of the phrases that comes to mind is "fake it until you make it." Has anybody heard that phrase before? Fake it until you make it.
Yes.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Yeah. Isn't it just like, I don't know, just a long shot here, but like basically just like put on a front until like I guess until you don't need to anymore.
Until something positive happens, right? Or until you feel better or
Yeah.
somebody else feels better, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so fake it until you make it. That means if you smile when you're actually sad, the act of smiling can carry you through the attitude change until you actually feel better later. And I will say there is a little bit of truth to that when we look at examples with the biofeedback theory with emotions. That can happen. Long term, with more serious events, and especially with the grieving process, might not be the healthiest way to do that. You know, we all hear of positive psychology. Positive psychology is a great practice. I use a little bit of that in my interactions in my therapeutic model, and it has some merit. But to have people pretend or say things that are positive when they inside don't feel positive doesn't always work, and it has to be looked at very critically to make sure that we're not actually pushing them further than what they were before we know it. What happens is there's a big disconnect with what they're saying and what they're feeling, because they may outwardly be showing that they're feeling good, but inside they're feeling crummy, and that could be a very, very big problem. So we look at trying connecting with how they feel, with how they're talking as close as possible, and then kind of move them up so that they're talking and feeling better at the same time. So just something for you to keep in mind, especially when we get into therapeutic models and talk about positive psychology. Okay, but sometimes we can manipulate ourselves this way, and it's an incredibly effective method people use to persuade each other. And your book covered some of those methods for persuasion, and we see a lot of these in sales today, such as foot in the door phenomenon. People tend to be, I'll write that down, foot and door phenomenon. Okay, so foot and door phenomenon is where they tend to be more readily to comply with a big request after they first agreed to a small innocuous request. Okay, like for example, again, I'm going to refer to the Darth Vader example because that was in one of the videos that I had put into the resources. So he didn't go from being sweet little Anakin to the dark overlord of the universe in overnight, right? It took about 9 hours of video for that to actually happen. In all reality, probably about 20 years, but he was slowly enticed to the dark side by a series of escalating actions and attitude changes, right? So do me a favor, right? Go run this errand. What was this? Palpatine, Senator Palpatine asked him to start running errands and doing these little things for him. And then before you knew it, he was killing little Jedis, right? And now he's going to ask him to blow up the planet. Okay. And he does. So what started out as a small action really went on to be really, really big ones. And it transformed that sweet little Anakin into, a Darth Sith overlord of the universe, right? And there are plenty of experimental evidence that moral action really does strengthen moral convictions, just as amoral actions strengthen amoral attitudes. And there is perhaps really no better example of this than what we saw with the Stanford prison experiment. Now, I'm not going to, I actually had a video and I don't have time to show it today, but the Stanford prison experiment was one that really rocked the institution of psychology for a long time. And it still does today, because we still see amoral behaviors that stem up very similarly to that. But back in the 1970s, a Stanford psych professor, Philip Zimbardo, and if anybody watched the video, he is that creepy in person. I've met him once already, once for one of his presentations. But he and his team put an ad in local paper looking for volunteers to participate in what was supposed to be a 14-day experiment. And after screening around 70 applicants, I think there were 24 college students that they screened them and deemed that they were physically and mentally fit enough to participate in the study. So for their troubles, they paid them, wait for it, $15 a day. $15 a day to work as a prison guard or be a prisoner. All right. So think about that. That's not a whole lot of cheddar, if you know what I mean, right? So things got bad enough in the experiment that only after 6 days they had to stop the experiment from continuing further, because what they were finding is that the prisoners, the student prisoners, were taking on the role of actual prisoners. They felt like they did something wrong and they belonged in there. And the guards were dehumanizing the prisoners in terrible ways. And it got so bad that even the researchers just thought, hey, this is a really cool experiment. It took a visiting assistant professor, I believe, or a visiting professor, I can't remember what her title was, but she came in and saw what was happening and said, wait a minute, Phil, buddy, what are you doing here, man? I mean, this is horrible. Do you see what just happened there? And of course they had it all on videotape, but everybody got sucked into their roles in this, and to the point where they had to shut this down, and it caused long-term harm to some of the people that were involved in that. So that's an example of people filling roles and taking on those roles. But you might be able to come up with your own example of how bad social influences are. And many people succumb and become compliant to terrible situations, but not everybody does. Lots of people risk their lives to, for example, hide Jewish people during World War II, or help runaway slaves along the Underground Railroad, right? Or generally just refuse to comply with or participate in actions that they don't believe in. Some people can, and they do resist turning to those evil temptations. And when it seems like everyone around them is doing bad things, they, in fact, these people tend to be the minority. So why? Why does it seem so easy to rationalize a negative action or attitude, so hard to muster and so hard to muster positive ones? One particular explanation comes from a social psychologist, Leon Festinger. He came up with the theory of cognitive dissonance. Dissonance. So cognitive dissonance. So I'm going to give you an example, and maybe some of you can follow along with this. Let's say that you have a particular value, and that value, that family value or personal value or belief, is that I will never work for fast food. Any of you that have worked at fast food would probably know why you wouldn't want to work at fast food, right? I actually worked at fast food. My first official job was working at McDonald's for many years of my life, which had its good and bad. And then on this other end, we have either an action or a belief. Okay. And we'll say, I'm sorry, action or behavior, not belief. So our action is we get a job at McDonald's. Okay. McD's. Now, why did that happen? Why would that happen? We already established our value is I'm not going to work at McDonald's. I'm not going to work at fast food ever. I don't want to do that. I want to work at Abercrombie and Finch, or what are some popular places to work? The difference between here and here is called cognitive dissonance. All right. When we're asked to do something that is absolutely against our value, and we do that, that creates kind of a tearing, a tugging and pulling on our values. And we can't have that. We can't exist in the world knowing that we've done that we're doing something wrong, because guilt consumes us. So it's easier for us to align this, lessen these two values and meet in the middle, somewhere closer to the middle. And we start doing that through justification. We start telling ourselves, well, times are really hard. I need a job. The only way I'm going to get a job is if I work at McDonald's or Wendy's or whatever. They're not so bad. I'll only do it for a couple of months. And we start justifying in a way so that we reduce that guilt and we can align our value. Our value and our action just a little closer. Okay, does that make sense? So let me give you an example. Back to our buddy Philip. He was sitting there in the corner, just being his shy old self. Maybe we don't know why, but all of a sudden he just jumps up and starts beating his friend up because he spilled a drink on his pants. Okay, he's likely experiencing some level of cognitive dissonance, and according to Fastinger's thinking, Philip might relieve his tension by actually modifying his beliefs in order to match his actions, like we talked about. So he might be telling himself, it turns out I'm not such a nice guy after all, right? He adjusts his disposition. Or maybe he'll adjust his situation and say, that was my new pants. And I don't normally do this, but I've had a really, really bad day. It's been stressful. It's unusual. So he might attribute that to his situation. So what he's actually engaged in there, remember we talked about FAE. What's FAE? Does anybody remember?
Fundamental attribution error.
Very good. So FAE, he now engaged in a fundamental attribution error. And he did that to preserve himself, right? It's complete opposite when we look at somebody and we say they're a jerk, they're mean, they're stupid, right? We attribute those ideas, we attach them to their disposition because it makes us feel justified. But when it's us, we look at more of the situation as opposed to saying I'm the jerk, right? I've had a bad day. And that's what we can see with cognitive dissonance. We narrow that margin between value and action just to justify what we're doing. And hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So let's see, what time do we got here? So I got a couple minutes left. I do want to cover social conformity. And if you have a moment, I think I have a video out there in resources that talks about Stanley Milgram. Great, really, it's probably one of my favorite experiments on social conformity. Yeah,
I was actually gonna ask you to talk about that a little bit, but if it's in the videos, it's okay.
Okay, so I'll just give you the brief idea of what Stanley Milgram. So what he did is right around the time of World War II, we were noticing that Nazis were doing horrible things, and we couldn't figure out why, because a lot of these people, these Nazis, they came from well-to-do families. They came from families that were church-going and believed in the rights of others. But for some reason, we found that these horrible people were doing horrible things. And we've termed that, Stanley Milgram termed that social conformity. So when we have somebody in authority or somebody that's credible telling us to do something, chances are we're going to act like we're going to act according to how they want us to. And he showed that with his experiment, which he did. He recruited both a teacher and a learner. And these learners were actually plants. They were Confederates. They were not, they were Confederates, but not in the Confederate sense. They were people that were hired by Stanley Milgram to pretend like they're participants, if that makes sense. So what they did is they set up a room where the teacher was sitting in front of this big box and the learner was behind a barrier, and the teacher was to ask questions. And this box that was in front of them went from like a little buzz to XXX, which indicated lethal. And based on the number that they got wrong, they had to administer the next level up to this person behind the box. Now, the person behind the barrier was not actually getting shocked, but every time they hit the button, they would shout. And it got up to the point where they were hitting that the participants were hitting lethal doses. So they thought that they were sending lethal doses to the person over there. And the reason they did that is because they had the experimenter, they had the assistant in the room telling them, it's okay, keep doing it, this is your job. And they did it. And we see that throughout. And to kind of exemplify that in more modern terms, I do have a quick little video here I want to play for you. Actually, the video that I had was a little bit long, so I'm going to see if I could change it quick.
I believe 67% of the people went all the way with the shocks.
Yeah, yeah, it's an alarming. And if you want a good movie to watch this weekend, talking about things to do, look up Experimenter. I believe it's on Amazon, and I don't know if it's on Netflix, but it's called The Experimenter. I can't remember if you look up The Experimenter, it'll come up. It's Stanley Milgram's, but really good depiction. A little artsy, but I thought it was certainly worth it. All right.
Can I get a quarter pounder with cheese?
I'll share this
Make that
video
too.
with you here in just a second.
Thank you. Hey, but I thought you said you.
Got to get through the.
Get it at McDonald's. When you buy one
Speaking of McDonald's, wow, isn't that weird? That's funny.
To see if this woman.
I'm telling you, our computers are listening. I think I won't say her name. Alexa is probably listening to me. All right, bear with me. Oh, she was listening to me. All right, so what they did is they set up an experiment. They had this woman come in for an eye exam, and everybody around her is a plant. So they're going to do something that they were told to do, and she's an unsuspecting victim. She just walked in here and she's sitting down for her free eye exam. So pay attention to what happens. Oh, actually, sorry, I gotta make a quick adjustment here so you can hear it and see it.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping.
All right. So, what do y'all think? Would you have
Pretty
done that?
interesting.
What's that?
I'm surprised she kept doing it after everyone else left.
Yeah. And it's shocking for us to see that as individuals, but I'm telling you, when we are in group situations, we act accordingly. Many of you went to school because that was the norm, right? That's what people do. We've equated that to success. Maybe your family has gone, or if your family hasn't gone to college, maybe your friends have gone, but you've understood this to be what the social norms are. So we do this more than you really would like to admit. And every one of us in the room, including myself, would like to say, I'm above that. I can critically think my way through not adhering to social norms, but pay attention to how much you do. And it's not a bad thing. You know, it's what makes us human and makes us a society. We are a pack animal. We thrive on the success of the people around us as well. So again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it could be a bad thing if it leads people to doing bad things to dehumanize or hurt other people. Hopefully that makes sense. So I'm going to stop here. Does anybody have anything they would like to add before? What did you think of the presentation? Did this make sense? Did it kind of like clarify what some of these theories are?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. If you like this class,